how does Bolsonaro's win in Brazil fit into a wider swing to the right in South America?
Good evening. It's out of any kind of doubt the victory of Mr. Bolsonaro, which is kind of a tectonic movement in Brazil, is also a definitive shock in Latin America. The wave of what we used to call here the pink wave of center and center-of-left governments has come almost to an end, and Mr. Bolsonaro's victory marks the victory, the coming into the political scene in the main Latin American country, the biggest one and the biggest economy, of the most ideologically extreme president that we have so far in the continent. He is welcomed by other governments that share some of the values of the center-right. The Colombian government has already sent a message to him, and he follows the line that goes from the United States to Argentina, from Mr. Trump in Washington to Mr. Macri in Buenos Aires, Mr. Piñera, who replaced Mrs. Bachelet in Chile, the Peruvian governments, which have been traditionally on the center-right, and now the Colombian government of Mr. Duque of the Democratical Center, the party of the former President Uribe, who replaced Mr. Santos. So the coming into the political scene as president of Mr. Bolsonaro reinforces the political right and reinforces some particular very strong ideological views of the political right in Latin America. One key point here that should be paid a serious attention to is the coming, the growing force and strength that the evangelical Christians, churches and group have been playing in Latin American politics. They played a very important role in the election of Mr. Bolsonaro, and they play a very important role in several other countries in Latin America, and they have been positioning up front into the public debate things like gender issues, like discrimination against LGBTI population, against minorities, a kind of discourse, a very misogynistic discourse against women, and so on. So we have to pay attention how this imbrication between religion and politics will continue to play a very important role here in Latin America.
And what do you believe are going to be the immediate implications of Bolsonaro's victory?
Well, if we think from a Latin American point of view, I do believe that the most immediate effect, even before he becomes president, is the change in the foreign policy in Brazil on behalf of Venezuela. The governments of Mr. Lula first and then Dilma Rousseff in Brazil had sided with, initially with Hugo Chavez and then with Maduro. Bolsonaro has announced that it will, his policy will be exactly the opposite. If under Mr. Temer that has softened a little bit, it's out of the question that under Mr. Bolsonaro there will be a serious change, and that the isolation, the growing isolation of Venezuela in the Latin American context in general, and in the Organization of American States in particular, will be reinforced, seriously reinforced. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why the Colombian government is happy with the election of Bolsonaro. There comes an ally, an important ally, on behalf of all the problems that Colombia has with Venezuela. A second important thing, I believe, is the relationship with the U.S. There are obvious closeness and affinities between, and not just in terms of political discourse, but also in terms of personality, of style, and so on, between Mr. Trump and Mr. Bolsonaro. And there is already an important group of Latin American countries that is siding with the United States, clearly, that has sided historically with him, and now in the current conditions, Mr. Bolsonaro will most probably jump on board of this coalition. And I would like to mention a third thing. outside of Brazil, this is not very much discussed, and is the environmental issue. Mr. Bolsonaro has plans for some kind of industrialization of the Amazonian basin. He has spoken about building dams and electrical power plants and so on. The Amazon, although most of it is in Brazil, is shared by four other Latin American nations, and any major impact Brazil or the Brazilian government will make into the Amazonian basin will have an overall environmental impact, not just in those four neighboring Latin American countries, but in the world as a whole.
Alvaro Sierra from France 24 en Espanol, thank you for joining us here on France 24 English.